How do we know if a qualitative study is any good? What are the criteria for a good qualitative study? These are the questions we will discuss in this second lecture. Just as there are a lot of discussion around the qualitative-quantitative debate, there is also a lot of discussion about the different ways to assess quality in qualitative methodology, and people can feel very strongly about the different approaches. One approach, which Tracy takes in her article, is to come up with universal criteria or standards that align with qualitative methodology generally and are not specific to paradigms or theoretical frameworks or strategies of inquiry. An opposing approach is to feel that criteria need to be specific to a paradigm or strategic inquiry. In other words, that there are criteria for arts-based methodologies, for example, and there are different criteria for post-positivist or pragmatic approaches. Another issue that arises in the criteria debates is whether we should translate or approximate criteria used in post-positivist quantitative methodologies and use those with qualitative methodologies. A rationale for this approach is to help with acceptance and understanding for reviewers who are not educated in qualitative methodology. This approach wants to either directly use language, such as reliability or validity, or to translate these concepts to words such as trustworthiness. Finally, there has been some discussion on whether it is best to provide checklists, like, did you include triangulation of data, yes or no, as opposed to having a more holistic approach to assessing the quality of a study. Lately, it feels like the field is leaning towards more universal criteria. In addition to the article you read by Tracy, here are some universal criteria by Patton and by Creswell. However, while both of these researchers have provided a list of criteria that work across different approaches, they also provide lists of additional criteria that can be applied within specific paradigms or approaches. These are both fairly pragmatic researchers, and they feel that there is room for both universal and specific standards to be used simultaneously. Looking at their lists of criteria, you can also see a fair amount of overlap between the different researchers. Issues such as reflexivity, ethics, the robustness of data, and the rigor of data collection all appear across these different universal criteria lists. Two questions we need to think about, however, are how do we handle the subjectivity of these different criteria? And once you do have a handle on them, how do we express them in your manuscripts and or your dissertations? We see a lot of criteria describes like prolonged engagement in the field or thick, rich description. But there are no benchmarks or ways of assessing what constitutes prolonged, or how do you assess rich description. The criteria are subjective by nature, so how do you know it when you see it? This is difficult enough when reviewing someone else's work, but even harder when trying to assess your own. The answer, unfortunately, is it depends. As we discussed in the lecture on sampling, it depends on the scope of your study and the breadth and nature of your topic. If you do believe you have rich, thick description, for example, where does it go in your paper? How do you convince your reader your manuscript has met these universal standards? Do you need to write a really long method section justifying how you did everything in your study? For that matter, how do you write a method section for a qualitative study? One thing to keep in mind is the requirement that the researcher is the key instrument or tool in a qualitative study. This means that reflexivity becomes paramount to quality work. We see this show up in the various descriptions of universal criteria in terms of honesty, sincerity, transparency, and authenticity. However, it also shows up in terms of the researcher's skills and abilities in the field. As we just discussed in the lecture on sample issues, getting thick, rich data is dependent, at least in part, on your ability to collect the data. How well do you interview or observe? Also, as Tracy points out in her article, evocative writing is a criteria of quality. This means a qualitative researcher needs to be able to write evocatively. This is not usually a requirement for most scientific writing. Finally, to move beyond the sense of we know that already, and to be able to turn what we think we know on its head, to be able to find the interesting and compelling story, to answer the so what question, a researcher needs robust data, but she also needs to be able to think theoretically and imaginatively. So, where does the argument or justification for quality go in a qualitative paper? The answer, as you may be guessing, is not to dump it all in the methods section. However, the methods section is still an important conveyor of quality. A methods section should also not be a long defense of qualitative methodology in general. Again, many researchers anticipate getting a reviewer who doesn't know or doesn't really accept qualitative methodology as legitimate, and they try to defend the entire methodology in their methods section. While this is not a helpful strategy, it is helpful to use the methods section to present evidence, examples, and as appropriate, citations to justify your design choices. Here is a sample analysis portion of one of my methods sections. Analysis sections are commonplace for researchers to fumble the ball in proposals and manuscripts. There's a tendency to provide blanket and generic descriptions of what you will do or have done with your data. There's also the tendency to oversell software and describe the software as analyzing your data. Both of these are big mistakes. You want to provide a description of the steps you took or will take, along with some concrete examples. You should try to unpack the black box that often happens in qualitative methodology. This is where themes magically seem to emerge from coded data. As you can see in this example, I provided a description of the steps we took as a team to analyze the data. I described developing a code scheme and coding the data. I also show how, once we started identifying several tensions, we went back to the data to examine specific documents that could elaborate on these tensions. I also include a paragraph on our approach to dealing with our own subjective bias, which speaks to the reflexivity practices we used. More importantly, I tie that process to the development of the theoretical framework of organizational culture that we ended up using in the paper. This is another example from one of my studies. Here, the data analysis approach was quite different. While the previous example was a case study that used a variety of data sources and centered the analysis around coding data segments, this was a narrative study. Here, we used a team approach to recreate the birth stories told in interviews and then to condense those stories to a poetic form. The second part of the same analysis section describes how the data, now changed into poetic narratives, were examined for common issues and compared and contrasted, resulting in a typology of stories that became the heart of the paper. While both of these descriptions are relatively short and leave out many details of the actual analysis, they do provide a description of the basic steps taken along with enough concrete details to provide a sense of the care in which the data were handled, as well as the systematic and interpretive process used. Within both, you can identify decision points, issues of reflexivity, transparency, and authenticity. These criteria of quality need to be interwoven throughout the manuscript. So now it is time to try to assess the criteria within an article. This week you read the Tracy article and a research article. I want you to write a review of the research article using Tracy's Big Tent criteria. You will need to identify examples where the criteria is or isn't met in order to provide concrete examples of what you did and didn't, what you think did and didn't work in the article. Once you have written the review, post it on the assignment in the module I created for this week. Then go to the discussion board in the module and write a short summary for your classmates on the process of reviewing the work. I want you to think about whether the universal approach, such as Tracy's criteria, worked. Why or why not? What parts were difficult to assess in the article and why? I want you to virtually discuss this topic with your classmates.